space you're taking up, and also to be respectful of others' pronouns, identities, and experiences, especially if you're here and you don't identify as LGBTQIA+. So we will have until 12:45 to kind of hang out in here, and our goal is going to be semi-directed, but relatively informal. And so because of the nature of Zoom and for safety reasons, we are having to individually promote people, so each of you, to a panelist position so that you can speak freely and share your answers to any questions that we have. And so do bear a little bit of, bear with me as I do that, because I'm going to have to individually do that for each of you who wants to say something. And so if you, as of right now, if you feel like, yes, I am here and I want to see folks and I want to be seen and I want to share my experience, please raise your hand in the chat and I'll start already making you panelists or give you the permission to talk. And so with that, Elaine is actually going to introduce themselves and start off the conversation, if Elaine is here. Okay, Elaine is not here. That is all right. So what I will do is start us off. So Elaine was going to talk about the importance of sharing our experiences and our stories and ourselves, because oftentimes we feel like we go through things in science alone. And so what he wanted to start out with is asking the question of, can you share a moment where your LGBTQIA+ identity resulted in a positive experience in academia? So if anyone wants to kick us off, I will make you a panelist and we can begin socializing.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Rishika. I am from India and
Oh. Rishika disappeared.
Hello.
Hello, you're back.
I think I got kicked out. Okay. So hi, as I was saying, I'm Rishika. My pronouns are she/her. I identify as a trans woman. I am pan-romantic and somewhere on the asexual spectrum, and I'm still trying to figure out what it exactly is. But I came out publicly as a trans woman in my institute, where I am currently doing my undergraduates, around a year back. And honestly, I was really scared. And because India is quite a conservative place, even though my institute is more or less liberal, I was really afraid. But to my shock, the amount of support I received, especially from professors who identify as cis and het, it was just amazing. Like, I never expected that they would be so accommodating, would be willing to listen to me and talk to me, and it was just an amazing experience.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else have similar experiences?
Yes, hello.
Hello, Alex.
Yeah, so I'm from Germany. I'm a medical student, and I'm currently doing a medical doctoral thesis, which is related to neuroscience, but not directly. But I also identify as a transgender woman, so I also prefer she and her as pronouns. And at least what I can say is that I'm like most of the time I'm outed, and I'm like most of the time open to other people about being trans. But for example, I also just outed myself to my professors, and from their side, there was also only positive reactions. But I guess it would be more on my side that sometimes I'm still a little reserved with myself. Like, how should I interact here in general? Because sometimes it still feels pretty intimidating. And most of the time, then it's still more in my own head where I might think, oh, will they all be reacting positively? So I guess it's half-half, still a little more in my head, but at least so far, I also can only tell about positive reactions. Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, and I totally appreciate the idea that you came up with, the idea that queer people could come here together and share.
I have to admit, I'm also was very intimidating to host this experience for everyone. So
I can imagine. Yeah. Yeah.
how about others? Anyone else have does anyone else want to share an experience or a moment where your queer or LGBTQIA plus identity resulted in a positive experience in academia?
If no one else wants to talk, I can share my experience.
Please.
I'm Mel. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a trans man and based in Turkey, very conservative environment. And I'm semi-out to some of my professors for safety reasons. I'm not out the rest. But eventually, through the end of my journey, I have to be out because my appearance is going to change and I'll sound different. My positive experience is actually NeuroMatch itself, because getting involved as a host and as a backend person since the start of NeuroMatch gave me hope that I could be part of academia someday. That's it.
Thank you for sharing. I do want to ask a question for folks. Do people have the capabilities of sharing their videos, or are you restricted? I'm not asking you to share it if you're uncomfortable sharing it, but I want to make sure people have the ability. Okay, great. People do have the ability. That's comforting. Great. Hello, I can see faces now. Thank you again for sharing that experience with us. Anyone else? I guess I can share my experience. This here is a very positive experience for me, in which my LGBTQIA identity, I identify as a queer cis man, has been very positive. In starting Queer Neuro, it was a bit of a whim, because I had kind of built this thing for myself, trying to find other queer presenting or queer identifying people in neuroscience specifically that I could invite to my institution to talk to me and others like me. And then when you find that there's no kind of concrete directory where I can kind of Google a list of trans neuroscientists doing neuroscience research, I decided to make one for myself, and then on a whim created the Twitter feed, and to see that it was received so positively by so many of you, and just to see all of you here and also all of you in the digital realm was overwhelmingly positive for me. So thank you all for being here. You've made a positive experience for me.
I completely relate with you, Daniel. It's just an amazing experience to find that there are so many people looking for a space to talk. And when you wanted it for yourself and you find so many other people who also want to be a part of it, I think that itself makes the experience like it validates your feelings and makes you feel like maybe what I'm doing is going to have a greater impact than just myself. And kind of going on from that, recently I started a small project which we are calling Diverse Neuro, which is, I think I had contacted you on Twitter about it, Daniel. So this is, we are trying to, because like you said, there is no directory of trans individuals. We just don't really know much about the queer community and a lot of other minorities within the neuroscience community. And from my experience with conferences like neuroscience, it's a very, very diverse community. And at this point, it would be very nice to maybe assess what are the lived experiences of these individuals in the neuroscience community. How are queer people experiencing their daily academic lives? So we started this project called Diverse Neuro. We are currently working to build a survey for individuals in the neuroscience community and assess their experiences. And it's a work in progress. The pandemic increased the workload a little bit and it's gotten a little hectic, but we are working on it and we would love to have input from all of you guys. So I'll share the details in the chat. So maybe if you guys are interested, we can work together on this and maybe find out more about our community within the neuroscience field.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. I would not only myself be very interested in helping you, but also I would love to take it and disseminate that to as many queer neuroscientists and scientists as I possibly could. That is in the chat there. So if you would like to take this survey, the link is now in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Is it okay if I talk?
Yes,
Hi,
of course.
so my name is John Hernandez. I'm a postdoc right now at Brown. A bit of my background, so I'm gay. I go by he, him, his. I'm from the South, so I literally fled the South to move up to the North in the United States. Love to talk about that at some point. But Rishika actually brought up something that was really cool. So one of the things that I'm doing now that I'm kind of more stable as a postdoc at Brown, with some colleagues, we're developing a nonprofit called Muse Mentorship, where we're a very, very diverse group of scientists. And our whole goal is to kind of make a for us, by us mentorship program. We just got our EIN approved, which means that we're on our way to have the nonprofit. But in that capacity, I'm working with another Latina from Puerto Rico, and we're developing surveys to evaluate how our mentorship approaches are impacting students that choose to be mentored by us. And it's really cool because I'm really proud to say I have now 6 mentees that are LGBTQIA, which is insane. I genuinely didn't even, I'd never even met a queer person in science before I moved up to the North. So it would be great to chat with you at some point about that, because our goal is we want to not just better our mentorship approaches and the way that we engage with the community, but we actually want to publish this. So I have a little bit of experience analyzing quantitative and qualitative data. So we want to turn this into a platform in an academic setting to talk about how, when you engage people with understanding who come from the same backgrounds as you, that you can make a really positive impact. So I would very much appreciate anyone's perspective on that. We will be collecting data pretty soon. So hopefully at some point in time in the future, I can share that. So yeah.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you for sharing that, John. And so we are going to eventually shift into what we've kind of labeled as the brainstorming process, which both of you have done phenomenal jobs kind of doing as well, where we'll kind of chat about what we as queer neuroscientists want this community to be, what projects we want to see happen, what we're currently involved in that we would like disseminated to the broader community. So those are two very amazing options that have got us rolling on that. Does anyone have any other positive, and now I'm going to open up to negative experiences, or moments where your identity as a queer person or a trans person have resulted in negative or positive experiences in academia?
I think I'll go. Hi, everybody. I'm Alan. Okay, so before I start, I'm a postdoc in London. I did my PhD in Tel Aviv University. And before I started my PhD, I already came out to my would-be advisor as bisexual. It was very important to me straight off to kind of present myself to make sure. And she responded fine, and she had other queer PhD students, so I was not worried. But then, about 5 years later, like near the end of my PhD, we sat in a coffee shop after a conference with another PhD student, and we got to the topic of identities. And then she said that her understanding of the bisexual identity is that that's a person that has threesomes with both men and women. And at the moment, it was kind of funny, but I was also shocked that my PhD advisor just assumed that this is what I told her all those years ago. That basically I kind of shared something very intimate about my life. And it kind of made me try to recount all the times I came out in academia and think about, wait, I didn't really try to manage, it wasn't long coming out stories. So what other assumptions do people have about me just because I shared my label? So it was both a funny moment, but also kind of a scary and an uncertain moment.
Thank you, Alan, for sharing that. I want to give a shout out to Alan specifically. Again, I said this earlier, but this social would not be happening if Alan didn't reach out and suggest the idea of the social. So thank you, Alan, for suggesting this and pushing it to happen. Anyone else want to share some experiences? Can be negative, can be positive, can be funny. I don't see anyone unmuting. So feel free to share them in the near future here. Also share them on Twitter if you're comfortable doing that, and we will promote that as well. I do want to move now. Alon, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to add, we had kind of a weird session here because of all the technical problems and stuff like that. I just want to add something about personal stories and why I think it can be a very powerful tool for us. I think one thing is that we have, in general, in our queer community, one superpower that we have is that we all have interesting stories, and we all have these shared experiences. And a lot of the times, what we experience is something very it's very alone, right? Every time we have these kind of negative experiences in front of like heterosexual people, for example, it can be very lonely, right? And I used to have these kind of circles of like discussion, we would call it like empowerment discussions, where we would just share our stories. There was nothing like motivational speaking about it. It was just us sharing our stories. And just by the power of seeing that what we thought was very solitary, we saw that actually other people have very similar experiences or very similar thoughts. I think that has a lot of power to kind of make us feel less alone and less lonely in this fight, you know, in our lives. So even if not here, really, I think that that's a good tool. If you have the energy to kind of share your experiences here, online, Twitter, whatever, I think that's always a brilliant thing to have.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I do want to know if you are uncomfortable sharing your experiences in this space now for any reason. For example, this is being streamed on YouTube. We will try, this is by no means the first and only event like this. We really hope to have these experiences and these events, hopefully semi-regularly, so that we can build this community together. And in the future, those events will be optionally recorded or shared. Our default as Queer and Neuro is to be private. We understand the complexities that comes with identity. And so we will never share people's stories or information without their explicit consent. And so I want to put that out there, that in the future, when we have socials, we will ask you if you would like those socials to be public or not, and respect those decisions, so that people who might be uncomfortable sharing those experiences now do feel comfortable sharing them in the future. Alrighty. So we've got about 10 minutes left before they boot us, and I've been told that the boot is very quick and very sudden. So I want to give us plenty of time here. So I want to move us into the last part of kind of our conversation. And so I want to know what kind of actions, either big or small, you want to see from an LGBTQIA+ organization in neuroscience. So for example, one thing you could ask for is more social events like this. Like that would be a relatively big or small, depending on the person, ask from a community or organization like this, is to host more of these informal social events to get to know each other.
I have one suggestion. We could use this platform, use this as a platform for queer neuroscientists to even come out and talk. And maybe we can give them a platform to talk about, even if it's their work, we can represent them from a queer perspective, which might be a good way to go. We can provide a platform for queer neuroscientists.
Great.
I'm thinking in the same vein, I recently saw like an initiative, I don't think it actually, anything came of it, of people volunteering to help review or comment on projects from marginalized people, right? And that was more about race experiences, but I think that maybe something that we can do amongst ourselves is if we have kind of a platform where people share what their kind of study is, maybe we can give each other feedback, right? Something that is always precious and to get. And so it's just to have our community, people that we kind of trust more, that have our back, right? So completely professional, but still just to have our pocket of people that we might come up, say, hey, I have this article, if anyone can spare the time, if anyone does have the time, right, that does have the energy and capacity for it, maybe they can do something about it. We can help one another.
Yeah. Oh, John?
Oh, I say I really like that idea, Elaine. I wanted to add that through Muse, one of the things that I'm working on, I'm calling it cafecito con leche, but what I'm doing is I'm trying to find faculty that identify with my mentees. And so far, I've already had one of my students meet with a faculty who's LGBTQ, and they submitted an application, which was really great for the Ben Bars. So I would be more than happy to contribute something like that. I think that's a really great way to build the community, and not just for our work, but also for applications, because there is a lot of knowledge, and if we can take advantage of those who have kind of done it before us, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but in writing certain personal statements or other grant-related projects, sometimes you do have to discuss your identity. And it's always a little bit awkward to kind of ask the person who is not queer identifying to kind of edit and speak to your story or something that you found pretty vulnerable. So having a network of other queer neuroscientists to kind of look over those personal statements and see how they could be bettered or changed, I think would be a benefit to myself, certainly. How about others? Do you have any ideas for activities that you want to participate in or see happen from an organization like this? We've got about 5 minutes as a reminder. Could be a job board. We've heard some folks ask for some sort of way in which either queer affirming PIs or other folks in the industry could promote their job opportunities. In the chat, SciComm talks from Openly Queer Scientist. I think that's a great idea. A lot of our talks have been focused primarily on scientists speaking about their work, but I would be very interested in the idea of promoting scientific communication to queer audiences or about queer things. I totally agree.
Sorry, what's SciComm?
SciComm is short for science communication, I believe. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong.
So is it more public engagement stuff or more communicating our research to researchers?
It's more focused towards layman and non-technical. So everyone who doesn't have a background in neuroscience might be able to. And having such talks from an openly queer individual might promote more people to join it, because they'll feel like there is some representation and it'll feel it's a safer space for them. I speak from personal experience.
Anyone else have any ideas that they'd like to share? We can go back to experiences they would like to share. Yeah, so two things that just came up simultaneously in the chat is some digital space where we can kind of convene together pretty rapidly to share, well, in general, to get in touch quickly. I think that's a great idea. For now, we haven't developed that yet. I think it's a phenomenal idea. What we have to be very careful about is the tiers in which we kind of work out the logistics for that, just because of the complexities of identity. So one way that we're hoping to build that is we have I'm going to share it in the link here. We have a form that we have made to kind of gather all of this information from people. So your email address, your identities, all of that. Again, this will be kept private. And this is kind of our first way of engaging with folks to get a good idea of how many people are out there. And so if you think that a really easily, if you all think that a way of communicating rapidly and very easily with each other is a good idea, that's certainly something we can pretty easily implement. We have a Queer Neuro Slack channel that I started. It's just me, so I can definitely add the rest of you if you are all interested. Okay, we've got about 2 more minutes left. Does anyone have any closing thoughts they'd like to share or ideas? Any contributions? Okay, well, I would like to thank all of you for coming. It was amazing to see all of your faces and to hear all of your experiences and share some of your ideas. I hope to see all of you at the Neuro-Racism panel, which I think follows immediately after this, and our panel, which is tomorrow. So.
I just wanted to ask, is there some way that we can stay connected to each other?
So what do folks, we have 1 minute and they're going to cut us off really quickly. What do folks think is the best way to get in touch with each other? Twitter, does everyone want to drop their Twitters in the chat so people can give a quick follow? The best immediate way to not contact? Alternatively, all of you can direct message me at Queer and Neuro, and I can make sure that we're all kind of connected together with your consent. That works as well.
Facebook group might work, but nowadays people are less and less on Facebook.
Yeah. Alrighty, so people are dropping their Twitter, which is great. And Twitter doesn't have to be our main means of communication.
I also do like the idea of a Slack channel moving forward at some point.
Yeah, Slack is also very good for organizing. So if we have kind of subcommittees who want to really focus on setting up a queer conference, for example, that's a really great place for that. So if anyone is interested in being on the Slack channel as well, please just DM Queer and Neuro, and we will definitely set something like that up. Alrighty, so they are pinging me to end the session. Thank you so much for everyone coming here and seeing you all. I hope you got a lot out of this. Bye, I'll see you later.
Thank you, Danielle.
Got a lot to get through. Okay. So everybody, I'm Deshane. I'm a third-year PhD student at Imperial College London, and welcome to this Neuro Match and Black in Neuro crossover event. So during Black in Neuro Week, we had a panel that explored the past, the current, and potential future biases that involve our field of neuroscience. So this was a very thought-provoking event that highlighted where our science has had adverse effects on the Black community and the ways in which this can continue and proliferate if left unchecked. So here we are today to continue this conversation. So this time we have Shalini Kataya, we have Dr. Kafwi Jaraza, and we have Abeba Rihani. And this is Neuro-Racism. So let's get straight into it. Shalini, I'm coming to you first. For those who don't know you, could you please introduce yourself in 2 or 3 minutes or so?
Sure. My name is Shalini Kantaya, and I'm the director of a Sundance documentary called Coded Bias that will be releasing virtually in theaters this November.
Perfect, thank you. And we actually had a prior screening of Coded Bias yesterday, and I have to say it was an amazing documentary. I'm going to talk a little bit about it today. Dr. Kafwi, can you introduce yourself to the people, please?
Yeah, how are you doing? My name is Kafwi Jaraza. I'm an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences, neurobiology, and biomedical engineering at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. It's great to be here today.
Thank you very much. And Abeba?
Thanks, Shane. Hi, everyone. My name is Abeba Brahani. I am a 4th-year PhD student now in cognitive science. I study in University College Dublin in Ireland, where I am currently.
Thank you. So Jalene, I'm going to come straight to you. So one thing that was really interesting, and as I said, we talked about, we watched Coded Bias yesterday. I know for a fact that you're not someone who's actually formally in this study and research. So I guess the first question is, what actually inspired you to direct and produce a film about artificial intelligence?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today and for hosting a conversation around this very timely issue of systematic racism and artificial intelligence. I knew nothing about this topic 2 years ago. I didn't know about algorithms or about AI. I'm a science fiction fanatic. So almost everything I learned about AI came from the imagination of people like Stanley Kubrick and Steven Spielberg, much as we know them. A lot of my work as a filmmaker has to do with disruptive technologies and the way that they impact communities of color and marginalized communities. And, you know, sort of my last work was looking at solar as a disruptive technology, as a way of uplifting communities of color. And I think I stumbled upon the work of Joy Buolamwini and thought this is an exceptional, first of all, quite with her in the opening scene of Coded Bias, I sort of stumble upon this discovery. I mean, Joy's just trying to make an art project work and discovers the fact that facial recognition doesn't see dark faces with accuracy. And it's not something I really understood. I will tell you that standing next to Joy and having a computer see my face, but not see her face, feels more visceral even more visceral than it does in the film. It felt very dehumanizing to witness a computer that would not see her face, to actually have that visceral experience. And so that set me on this journey. And I think what was so incredible, I think, about Joy's research was her discovery that facial recognition is racially biased doesn't have to do with some technology that's on a shelf somewhere or in a laboratory somewhere. This is stuff that is already being sold to the FBI, to ICE and immigration officials, and already being deployed often in secret by police departments across the country. A lot of the research that I was able to collect comes from Europe because there are laws there. So you can actually see this stuff. There's some transparency where you can witness how police departments are experimenting with these racially biased invasive surveillance tools. But here in the state, they're often used in secret. And what we saw was the first ever reporting of a misidentification of a Detroit man who was arrested in front of his friends and his family, his neighbors and his family, held for 30 hours, the kind of stuff that you don't recover from, and never asked for his license, never asked to show his ID because of the kind of authority that facial recognition is giving. And so quite alongside Joy in the making of this film, I went from being like, oh, that's interesting, to, oh, that's really terrifying, and literally dovetails with every civil right and human right that we enjoy as citizens. And so I'm so grateful to host this screening. What I've learned in the making of this film is that it's actually Black researchers that are leading in this field of bias in artificial intelligence, and women at that. And so I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation of how we can actually lead the conversation. And I also just want to start by saying that in June, we saw sea change that we never thought was possible in the legislation of these technologies. We saw the three most powerful technology companies in the world, IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon, all said that they would press pause on the sale of facial recognition to police departments. And that happened because of brave researchers in my film, like Joy Buolamwini and her colleagues, Timnit Gebru and Deborah Raji, but also because of a movement, the largest movement for civil rights and equality that we've seen in 50 years. And people making those connections between technology that is racially biased and a movement for the inherent value of Black life and the people who have the most at stake when these technologies are deployed. And so I feel that we're in a moment where we sort of have a moonshot moment to hold these technology companies accountable, to push for ethics, to push for fairness and transparency in the technologies of the future. And I'm so grateful to organizations like yours for leading the conversation. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So Abeba, I'm going to come to you next, actually, to kind of piggyback a bit off that. So I know that you're someone who's talked quite a lot about AI and its adoption. So can I actually ask you what particularly about or what certain aspects of artificial intelligence or its use concern you at all?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, even though I am in cognitive science, technically speaking, my work is actually, it sits at the intersection of examining machine learning systems and their negative impacts on society in general, and in our sense of personhood, and in what it means to be a person in this day and age. Yeah, to kind of simplify, or to put it in a simple way, about aspects of artificial intelligence that concern me. I think the Princeton professor Arvind Narayan, he is at Random Walker on Twitter. He's brilliant. Everything he posts is great. So he has classified AI systems into three broad categories. One is the very kind of matter of fact object detection kind of applications. A good example might be Shazam. So if you download the app with a little bit of the sound of a tune, that system can identify the artist, the name of the song or whatever. And in the middle, in the second group, he has systems that require kind of judgment. So kind of in the gray area, an example is spam detection. And in the third category, he has this very broad application of AI, which basically predict social outcomes. So these are scientifically very dubious because they are very inaccurate, because the social world and human behavior is really difficult to fully understand and to predict with precision. We are not objects. We are human beings with values, with cultures and with continual interaction with other people. So any attempt to predict how I will behave in the future or how I will act, scientifically speaking, is impossible, because there are a million possibilities for me to be. But also, are they not only scientifically dubious, they are also ethically a huge red flag, because when these applications of social outcomes is, they are applied in hiring and in law enforcement, in the some of it Shanley was touching upon. So anything like predicting criminal behaviors, or any application within the welfare system, so anything within the social sphere, it's a big red flag, and it is both scientifically dubious and ethically very problematic, because they also disproportionately negatively impact people that are at the margins of society. So these are disabled people, it might be the trans community, Black women. So anything that is farther away from the status quo pays the heaviest price. Yeah, and following that category, those anything predicting social outcome, anything in the third category is very alarming.
Thank you for that. Wow. So I guess I'll kind of take a little shift and I'll go to Dr. Caffrey, but you touched on that disproportionate effect. So Dr. Caffrey, in your research and your current themes, research themes, do you see any biases or disparities specifically regarding mental health and mental illness?
Yeah, so I'll address this question by starting from a slightly different angle, right? In which the objective is for whatever algorithms you do to address and predict well, right? So, we talked about the challenges of them being deployed at a scale in which there's no prediction. I'll adjust from the health angle in which you want to be able to predict, right? Because any diagnostic, you want it to be able to predict and shape and scope very well, or it doesn't apply to whole populations. So I've been thinking about this more recently. I'm a psychiatrist and a biologist and an engineer. And I've been thinking a lot about how one would develop diagnostic measures that make sense for psychiatric illness, right? Knowing that in the context of psychiatric illnesses, you have all these challenges of context, right? At their core, psychiatric illnesses are deficits in social behavior, and what it means to function normally from a social aspect is different across cultures and across perspectives, right? And so if there's a way for us to objectively link what we call changes in normal behavior to an organ in a way that is objective and clear, then at least we can, at a population level, come up with new treatments. And if we ultimately develop algorithms that don't fit everyone, we develop treatments that only work for a subset of people. And so you can see how data on that side presents a new challenge, right? Our goal in the health condition is we actually want to generate models that generalize. In other words, right? We don't just want to have a diagnostic that works for men, but not women. We don't just want to have a diagnostic that works for adults, but not children. We don't want to develop a diagnostic that works for people of one ancestry versus another. And as I get in these conversations, we also always raise the issue of race and say, well, race is a biological construct, or it's a social construct, not a biological construct. And while I think it's important to acknowledge that, I will say race, and more specifically racism, right? While it is indeed a social construct, I'm a neurobiologist, so social constructs have biological effects that are clear and could be measured. In fact, in mental illness, stress is one of the biggest mediators of well-being in the context of mental illness. So racism itself, though it may be a social construct, it has clear and measurable biological effects, things that we may measure and monitor at the level of epigenetics for all the neuroscientists out there, but it changes the brain, right? So racism can fundamentally change the structure, the gene expression, and the function of an organ in our head called the brain. So I think about how one would generate diagnostics and measures that apply to how we ultimately think about monitoring, quantifying, and treating mental illness. And one of the biggest advances that have been made in the last 20 years, 20 or over years, is our ability to create an understanding of the genomic architecture of the human being. This is the human genome. In other words, we're able to create a map of the human genome. And the idea there was that over time, what we'd be able to do is identify genes for illnesses, right? So you could have a genetic mutation for sickle cell, or a genetic mutation for cystic fibrosis, or a genetic mutation that gives you risk for cancer. And if we can find what these genes are, we can ultimately find out people who are at risk and stratify them and come up with treatments. Well, it turns out mental illness is not one gene, one illness, right? What it is, it's a complex architecture of a lot of different gene profiles, right? You have to have a lot of little bits of change in your genome that then pull together to create mental illness. Well, this is where the problem comes in. So as scientists have started to study this genomic architecture, it's a huge data problem, right? And we solve data problems the way we solve other data problems. We use machine learning and artificial intelligence to identify patterns, with those patterns linking to the disease condition. This is the same with mental illness, this is the same with heart disease, it's the same with cancer. Genomic profiles, large genomic profiles, linking them to disease conditions. Well, as it turns out, the genomic databases that they've been using to identify these patterns, which would ultimately be your diagnostics, which would ultimately guide disease treatment, are tremendously overpopulated. Overpopulated is an understatement. They're overpopulated with genomic databases of European ancestry, right? Mm-hmm. And for any animal researcher out there, I work in mice, we can understand this challenge, right? Because if you have two strains of mouse, we don't even accept that it's a strain of mouse until we've back crossed it 10 generations. In other words, 10 lines of ancestry. It has to be like travel that way for us to believe that we are studying that mouse. And if you go from one mouse strain to another mouse strain that is back crossed 10 generations on a different line, everything looks different, right? A gene that's high in one case causes illness, it's low in the other, causes illness, right? It's all over the place, right? So understanding the architecture of the genomic landscape matters a lot for how we link it to phenotype. So the problem is, for us, ancestry literally means generation. Like if you think about 10 generations of humans, it's like 400 years, right? So if you're thinking about how genes have evolved over time on 400 years, ancestry matters a lot. And if it's hyperpopulated with Europeans, the European population left the continent of Africa. And so you have a genomic landscape that is developed in Europe that is not the same genomic landscape that's available in other parts of the world. And so as our entire enterprise is building an architecture around what it means to have disease, it's being built for 16% of the world, right? And so you can look at this and figure out what the model is that you've learned, right? The genomic landscape, the picture, the architecture. You take that same sort of profile and you go to someone of a different ancestry. I like the word ancestry because it makes a lot more sense to describe it as ancestry than race, right? Ancestry, we are biological organisms, right? So our ancestry is how our genes pass down. Everyone believes that. It's not controversial. But if you look, the models that have been developed on genomic databases that are overpopulated with people of European ancestry do not extrapolate as soon as you go to another case. Now, this isn't even, we're not talking about a starting point where we're saying people of African ancestry have much better health outcomes. And so it makes sense to bring equity by hyper-focusing on European populations, right? It is actually quite the inverse, right? So people of African ancestry, particularly when you look in the United States, right, have way worse health outcomes, right? You can, and this was a case that I could have made before. I could have said it was heart disease. I could have said it was cancer. I could have said it was diabetes. COVID has made all of that clear. Right? Like there are health differences. And so there are clear health differences, what you call health disparities. And we're applying this entire engine, right? This entire engine of precision medicine, this entire engine of understanding what it is to think about brain and genomics. We're applying this entire engine to the 16% of the world population who, especially in the United States, has much better health outcomes than everybody else. And a lot about the enterprise has now shifted to think about this problem, to figure out how to address this. But if you start a race way behind, you actually never catch up, right? Unless you put all of your energy into the participant that's behind. So that's what we're now wrestling with, right? It's this idea that the entire enterprise has been organized around studying disease and disease landscape, primarily when we're talking about precision medicine in a way that applies to a segment of our population. So sorry for being long-winded, but I wanted to make it very clear how these health outcomes, the health disparities, what we're seeing in the context of COVID, right? Mental health, which is clearly going to be the next wave, even if we get rid of the virus and we have the perfect vaccines, right? We will have traumas that remain with us as a population of humans, right? Because of the mental health impacts of what's happening now, from the separation, from the social isolation, to the being parent and teacher, and we're all of those things simultaneously, right? To being thrown on the front lines because you're an essential worker because we have to eat meat, right? All of those things that are happening are going to be lasting traumas, and you can see how all of that converges in this moment where we're talking about race and equity and data and artificial intelligence and health. All of those things converge in this moment. So thank you for having me here. I'm a little passionate about this.
No problem at all. Thank you. So I'll take a little bit of what you said, which again, well, you were talking about the 16%, but I guess in a Western context, we're talking about those who would be considered to be on the fringes of society, so to speak. So in a world that's becoming increasingly dependent on automation, how do we actually buffer and protect those people? And I'm actually going to throw that out to Beba on that one.
Yeah, sure. That was very fascinating, by the way, Dr. Kafwi. Yes, thank you.
And scary, sorry.
Yes, yeah, and you put it so succinctly. Thank you. Yeah, how do we, in a world where automation is becoming ubiquitous, how do we protect those at the fringe, right? That's your question, yeah. That's a really good question. So on the one hand, as Dr. Kafwi has put it succinctly, it's important to pay attention and study the population or the ancestry that has been left out for so long. In that case, you will have you will bring the various ancestries to some kind of common ground where you can compare, right? So in that case, you need more data, you need to study more, you need to focus more on that kind of ancestry, or on those that were on the fringe that were left out. So that is one approach to, I'm gonna take, this is not what you said, Dr. Kafwi, but I'm gonna put it I'm gonna push it a little further and say one approach is to throw more machine learning systems, to throw more artificial intelligence, and to also study that population as much. But that is one approach, and that's also a double-edged sword. In a sense, it gives you a kind of a level playing ground where you can compare and contrast. But on the other hand, when you are, in the case of medicine, mental health, but also other social issues, when you hyper focus on individuals in communities that are disproportionately impacted or that are at the margin, take the trans community again, kind of gathering so much data and throwing so much machine learning systems is not going to be that helpful. You are, in a sense, kind of hyper focusing on people that may not want to be, found out or discovered or understood. And the other side, the other downside of this approach is that, in a sense, by putting so much time and so much emphasis on gathering data, on developing machine learning systems to study these populations, we also emphasize, we also implicitly or explicitly assume that more data and more machine learning and more models are the solution, whereas maybe not. So in the case of, again, going back to Shalini's point, in the case of, say, face recognition systems, when that fundamental research, Gender Shades, came out and showed us that Amazon's facial recognition systems recognizes, for example, the white male population at a much higher accuracy compared to Black women. One solution is to make that system recognize everyone as accurately as possible. But on the other hand, you can kind of take a step back and zoom out and say, hold on, maybe we don't need the facial recognition system in the first place. So yeah, we can have both approaches, gathering more data, developing more machine learning systems, but also asking the fundamental question of, do we actually need these systems that we are developing in the first place? And asking the why rather than, I mean, those two are not mutually inclusive. mutually, they can work. They are complementary, is what I meant to say. Yeah, so I don't know if I have answered your question, but these are the two approaches to, I guess, to focus on equity and to bring about a system that works for the minoritized and for the underserved communities and groups.
Yeah, let me just echo that, because I think you make two really important points that project really clearly into the health enterprise, right? So if you frame it as an issue of ancestry, right? So the topic around ancestry, it very well may be the case that different ancestries have solved different genomic health challenges differently, right? In other words, one ancestry may have a gene pathway that produces resilience, and another ancestry may have another gene pathway that produces resilience. And by studying both of them, one might learn how to move the resilience emergence pathway or gene pathway from one ancestry to another, such that you can help disease in both cases, right? Now, that might, to solve that, one would say, well, obviously you can see the benefit of now having genomic data sets that are populated by multiple ancestries, because we can figure out if biology has solved things in different ways, and we can move health and cures across in different spaces, right? But then it wouldn't be a surprise if at the end of this, health and cures and that genomic information was only moving in one direction, right? In other words, we were learning things from one ancestry and then only applying the cures to another without actually going in the other way, right? You could see a framework in which this could very, very, very easily happen, right? If there's a part of the world that has a protection against a certain environmental pathogen, right? And then that cure and solution is used in this setting to help another disease condition like heart disease, right? But that solution from population A has never moved back the other way. So in order to protect against something like that, I think to your point, one of the things that's going to be incredibly clear is having scientists who are both community and in touch with community driving the research agenda, right? The issue here and the challenge here couldn't be any more present and obvious in the United States, right? Given that our public health biomedical research enterprise, the majority of those taxpayer dollars go through the NIH. It's got about $42 billion budget a year. And in a country that by 2045-ish will be majority minority, 1% of the NIH-funded investigators are Black and 5% are of Latin origin, right? And even within that percentage of investigators that are Black, there are disparities in grant funding, right? Even when you control for the fact that they went to the same universities, have the same publication records and everything else, right? So it should not be surprised that layered on top of an enterprise like that, you see disproportionate death from COVID, disproportionate heart disease, disproportionate, right? All of that, right, is a challenge. And then you say, well, how can you get more people to participate in the scientific enterprise? Because we need humans to be in the human trials, right? If we want a vaccine to work, everyone has to take it, which means we need all sorts of people in there. Well, now you don't have Black scientists leading the trials who are in touch with community, who understand community, and the whole thing falls apart, right? So if we're going to advance an enterprise, and I'm all for equity, targeting the challenges that you've raised actually requires us investing in generating and training the next generation of scientists that look more like the populations that we serve, because it has clear health implications. And we need to think about this more broadly for how we think about all technology, right? I mean, I can tell you this for sure. If I've gone to many a bathroom and put my hand under the thing and no toilet paper comes out, right? And I'm like, oh, it doesn't work. And then the next person comes and they put their hands out and it comes out, right? Over and over and over again. And I can tell you one thing for sure is that if I was making the dispenser, it will come out for me every time because I'll be testing it on my own hand, right? So we need to think more deeply about getting folks into the technology creation space and the research space, which is why I think these efforts that you all are leading are so important, right? It is so important to get young people watching these documentaries and excited about science. It's so important to talk about these issues more broadly amongst the scientific community. As I mentioned, I spent all of my time thinking about mice, right? But this issue was so clear to me because it's so obvious. So thank you all for doing this and spreading the issue more broadly. You play such an important role in making the community the scientists. So thank you.
Yes,
very
sorry,
much.
I will just very quickly echo Dr. Kafui there. Yes, absolutely. And I think the phenomenon of what you described is known as the privilege hazard. When you have a homogeneous group of population designing and developing and deploying software, you know, from the very first stage of designing, from deciding what kind of technology we need, you know, what kind of data we need as inputs, and what kind of performance is good enough, making all those decisions by homogeneous group, what you end up is kind of echoing the interests and the motivations of that homogeneous population. And if you look at much of the tech industry, it's as homogeneous as it gets. It's very much populated with white men. And what you find also, as Shalini mentioned earlier, if you look at a lot of research coming, especially over the last 3 years, coming out of the AI ethics space, whether it's exposing the fact that face recognition systems don't recognize Black people as well as white, or whether object detection systems don't recognize Black-skinned pedestrians compared to white people, whether it's the hand sanitizer, a lot of research coming, exposing all these injustices and inconsistencies and inaccuracies comes from mostly Black women, from the population that is impacted the most, because, as you know, the principle of the privilege hazard would have it, if something doesn't affect you, you are blinded, you are unable to see it, it's not a problem for you. So yeah, just to echo Dr. Kafui here, yes, we need the next generation of Black scientists, Black engineers, who can anticipate problems and who can kind of catch negative consequences before we actually design and develop and implement you know, any safe software technologies.
Yeah, sometimes this feels so abstract. And you all probably caught this after the killing of George Floyd. There were like a lot of really big, really well-known genomics companies that released like public statements that said things like, you know, we need to do better. We've contributed to the problem. We promise to do better. They didn't really articulate what that meant. This is what that meant. Right? It meant that they have built capitalized companies built on this idea that their genomic databases were highly populated with people of European descent, and they worked for them, and they had not thought, or let me not say not thought, they had not invested enough resources to correct that problem until there was a knee on somebody's neck. Right? So I want you all to understand how present this is and how hidden it is at the same time. And it doesn't just show up in the video detection that's happening. I have global entry now, so I come in the country and it sees my face and there's apparently video detecting me, right? I hope this works every time and accurately, right? But like, this is everywhere in our society now, right? This is like literally on the health enterprise side as well. So it's just something we all need to be mindful of.
Definitely. I'm going to bring Shalini back in, if you don't mind. And it's based on a few of the points that have been said. But Shalini, could I ask you to touch a little bit on, from your research and doing the documentary, the implications actually if we leave the status quo unchecked, but if we just continue down this path?
Yes, I first want to just say respect. Because on this call already, it's like not even 3 p.m. and I learned that most AI predictive systems that are trying to predict human behavior are pseudoscience, and that our entire science system is based on the genomic study of 16% of the population that have better health outcomes than the rest of us. So respect. Thank you so much for the amount of wisdom in this conversation. I feel like, you know, as a misfit artist, what I've learned is how hard this goes down on communities of color. Like even when you see that it was like a Latino teacher who was getting bad, the algorithm was saying, you're a bad teacher. And this was a teacher literally that made me cry. His passion for his students was so committed and dedicated, and had been teacher of the year 12 times. And an algorithm comes along and says, you're not a good teacher. And I think that we put so much intrinsic faith in these algorithms that it becomes like, you guys say it in science, I'm going to say it in science fiction. Basically, when 1984 was written by George Orwell, Aldous Huxley wrote a book called The Brave New World. And Aldous Huxley, both science fiction writers, writes a letter to George Orwell around that time, and basically says, like, 1984 was a great book, but in the future, people will not have to oppress people by stick and by stone, by bat, by force, basically. That the systems of oppression will become so opaque to us that people will willingly participate in their own oppression. You know, that the tools will be so wide. And I think that is what I've seen, that these systems have become so opaque that all the civil rights advances that were fought over 50 years will be rolled back under this guise of machine neutrality. And you see it. And what I learned is that literally everything we love as citizens of a democracy, all the advances that were made around equality, fair voting, access to housing, fair employment, a fair criminal justice system where people of color don't get undue sentences and undue police scrutiny. All of those things, fair immigration, are going to be transformed by AI. And that power is in the hands of very few people. And even the knowledge, it means so much to me. I'm so grateful to the brilliant and badass cast of the film. And you guys are also brilliant. I couldn't talk to people for 2 years because I was trying to explain this. And people at parties would be like, what are you working on? And I'd scratch my head and be like, I'm working on a film about racist robots. And it was so hard to bridge that gap in public education. And yet so much is at stake. I feel like every civil right that we've won is at stake. And like you said, like these systems are so invisible to us, and we've not yet had the basic scientific understanding. And let's be clear, this scientific understanding is led by people of color, by women, by LGBTQ, and every marginalized community that helps tech see into the blind spots of their, the bias of their homogeneity. And so what I really hope the film does, very humbled, and I'm very humbled to be in the presence of this scientific knowledge, is create one is to start to disseminate that scientific knowledge so that brilliant people like the both of you can be on a call with someone like me, and we can still sit at the same table and have a discussion about how this impacts us as a kitchen table issue, as things that affect working people. And then the other thing I hope that we can start to do is connect the science to emotional storytelling. One of the special things that I really appreciate about Joy Buolamwini is that she has this incredible ability, because she comes from a marginalized community, to not have such integrity in the science where she'll put her personal reputation on the line to go after the most powerful technology companies in the history of the world and feel okay about doing that because she has the integrity of the scientific method behind her, which I don't, you know, that kind of brilliance, but also that has this connection to the people who can most be hurt by this. And I think that in the film, I start to question what intelligence is, and whether there can be such a thing as intelligence without empathy, without humanity. And I would go as far as to say is that I don't think it can, that we need to infuse technology with a kind of humanity, with our own processes, with some transparency where we can catch errors. And so I'm so grateful to be part of this call, because it's the kind of science and the translation of science to kitchen table issues. And it's my hope that the film will start to connect people who have been hurt by algorithmic bias, the researchers and scientists who've been shining a light on this stuff for decades. Coded Bias is based on 2 decades of outstanding research and scholars and activism and journalists working in this space, that I'm so proud to be part of that lineage. And also to engage the public and traditional civil rights organizers. And I know a lot of my friends work on traditional civil rights issues. And when I first started bringing this to them, their eyes would glaze over when I would start to tell them about algorithmic bias. And I'm like, no, this is where it's going to go down. And so I feel like we have this huge learning curve between great scientific thinkers of color and researchers, and also people on the ground. And I hope that this movement will start to bring those voices together so that we can move the dial.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more from the standpoint of thinking about what emotions mean, and how one would build that into the framework of intelligence. I don't suspect we have time to get onto it today, but if y'all invite me, I will be happy to jump on another panel. We could hash it out for a couple of hours. We could do it at a happy hour. I would be happy to engage you all around that also. Let me just say, I was thinking about this as you were making the point about strides and progress around criminal justice and voting and all of these other things. And I think what's always important to remember is that not everybody considers that progress, right? In fact, some people perhaps have a problem with what other people consider progress, right? So there are always vested interests on the other side. And those vested interests can be organized around whatever power represents in a society. And those can then be transformed into the systems that you can't see. In fact, that is the approach that one which wants to push back on a narrative that might be more popular and more appreciated would take, right? You would figure out how to push back in a way that people didn't understand that you were pushing back. And that allows a small few to shape the behavior and the outcomes of many. So I think it's always important to keep that in mind. While we all have altruistic, or many have altruistic ideas about what equity means, especially in a time like this, there are people who benefit from things not being equitable.
Well, I don't think there's really much more I can actually add to this conversation. It's funny enough, we're actually very close to being out of time. But Paper, I'm going to come to you for a final word. If you've got anything to say, just kind of really summarizing some of the topics that we very briefly covered today.
Yeah, very briefly, I will just add to the discussion on emotions and empathy and creating systems that with empathy. I just want to say it's really important to remember that there is always a person behind the code. There is always a person thinking, oh, here is the kind of tech we need. Oh, here is how we are going to, develop it. So it's always like, it's not the robot is racist or the AI is racist. It's the people behind it doing things, creating a system. So then what that means to creating a more emotional, a more empathetic AI system is kind of flipping the objective of what you are trying to do. So at the moment, whatever application of AI you see, a good example is you have proctors, AI systems that are supposed to catch dishonesty during exams when you are taking your exams on the screen, by analyzing your eye movement, by detecting facial features or whatever, totally scientifically bonkers. But also, if you look at it, it's designed to help those in power, whether it's the professor, whether it's the university. It's not designed to help the end user or the student that's taking the exam. Another example is a recent one where they, I think MIT startup created a virtual system that can help you, that can fire an employee for you. And again, it's not, people are not creating a system to help the end user, the person that's being fired, the vulnerable individual or community. It's all about how do we make it easier for the powerful and how do we make money. So in order to kind of flip the objective and create something sympathetic, we have to think about how is this system that we are creating going to empower the most marginalized? How is it going to help them? How is it going to protect their welfare? And that is not something that's compatible with the current model, which is very capitalist, which is all about efficiency, making money. So it's a lot of work. I hate to conclude with a negative message, but it requires a lot of work and changing objectives and prioritizing the need and the welfare of the person that is impacted the most.
Thank you very much, Beba. I would say that it's not that you are ending on a negative point, but it's a thought-provoking point. The fact that we're actually saying to participants that we should consider changing that lens. I think that's very important to look at, that we don't have this dependence on AI as something that is just going to serve the interests of a few, but actually serve the interests of the majority of us. So thank you to all the panelists today. We have run out of time, but this is definitely a conversation that we would like to continue. Thank you for joining us. And in 10 minutes.
Can I just say one thing?
Oh yeah, we all wanted to just add one thing. I just wanted to say, I hope that people continue the conversation. Codedbias.com/screen has where you can screen the film, follow the hashtag #CodedBias. And I hope in November that you'll all come to the theater, the virtual theater, to screen the film and host more conversations like this in November. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.
And let me just say, I am a capitalist, but I believe in the importance of democracy to balance it. So if you're in the US, please vote.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, everyone. And we'll end it there.
In the previous hour.
I said I was just trying to warm it up for the three of you. So
I heard he lit it.
Give him a little opening act.
You did a great job. Great job. This is good. Reverend, now you like to have your library behind you. I like to have the Lieber Institute lobby behind me.
I know, man. I one day I'll get that background.
I'll have to send it to you. I will send it to you.
Yeah, send it to in my lab coat.
Kath, I have to send it to you. When we get out of this, when we're all able to get around a little more, we have to get a picture of all of us.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Lieber Institute lab coats.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that day, and I won't go till you say go, Danny.
Yeah. This is going to be
I guess it's 2 o'clock.
Eventful week.
Start?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So I'll introduce myself first, and then I'll turn over to our panelists. So my name is Gwenael Toma. I'm one of the co-organizers of Black in Neuro, and I'm also a 5th-year PhD candidate at Duke University School of Medicine, actually co-mentored by Dr. Jarasa here himself. and I'll turn over to you. So can you briefly introduce yourself and describe how you got involved with the African Ancestry Project?
Yeah, so I guess I'll open it up for the team. So I'm actually the last person on our group to get involved, and I was I get invited to give talks a lot, and so I was up giving a talk at Hopkins in February. This is back when people used to travel to give talks. And I was up there, and I had a chance to sit down with Dr. Weinberger, and we're sitting in his office, and he started giving me a real a lesson on genomics research. I'm a mouse researcher, so I only think about genomics to the extent that I'm mutating them or modifying them in the mice. But he gave me a real lesson on genomics research. It's links to how we were thinking about the next generation of treatments in the Precision Medicine Initiative. And then, much to my surprise, I'd always thought about folks of African ancestry being underrepresented in genomics studies. But one of the things he brought my attention to was that the large genomics studies didn't have people of African ancestry in them at all, right? And I don't like to use the word excluded, but because I believe in statistics and data science, it's really hard to figure out how in millions of subjects you sort of randomly don't include folks of African ancestry. But it is a real wake-up lesson for me. And as we were talking, he mentioned, and I'll let my esteemed colleagues tell you more about the history before that, but he mentioned that he and a team were working to do something about this, this absence of research. This is something that's personal for me. I have people in my family with mental illness. And so the idea that these large-scale genomic studies weren't being built on a foundation that applied to me and my family was something that troubled me greatly. And so I knew that some way, somehow I have to be involved. I have incredible roots into Baltimore as well. My family's in Baltimore. I went to undergrad in Baltimore County. My sister's the Baltimore Health Commissioner. So it's just a very natural connection for me to join the initiative. And I'll let my colleagues tell you more about how the initiative came to be and all of the work that they've done before I had the opportunity to lend a little bit of my expertise to the initiative.
Yeah, if I may, my name is Reverend Al Hathaway. I'm a Baptist preacher in Baltimore City, the pastor of Union Baptist Church, which is a historic church, 168 years old. And this church has had a tradition. I'm the 10th pastor in that 168-year history. And that church has always had a history of advocacy. We were early on back in terms of 1865, we launched what is now known as Bowie State University, which is the first HBCU in the state of Maryland. And then later on, we took a case to court dealing with the Stewart sisters back in 1883. And that case involved the first real case where there was a ruling of that African Americans, we had Plessy versus Ferguson. So this ruling basically came down and said that persons who were Negroes was not chattel in interstate commerce. And so there's always been from running a congressman in 1968 and then 1970, you had the first African American congressman going to the 7th Congressional District, Congressman Clarence Mitchell. So our church has always been active and involved in the civil rights and human rights movement. So when it came to my attention, and I traveled to the Lieber Institute, talked with Dr. Danny Weinberger and his team to find out that African Americans were underrepresented and maybe possibly even excluded in the area of neuroscience research, it became clearly a sense of advocacy for myself. And I was introduced to it by a dear colleague and friend, Martin Knight, and he brought to me that this is something that needs to be addressed. So out of that social justice lens, I began a process of advocacy with Lieber to see, one, how can we make certain that we level the playing field? Two, how can we make certain that there are resources for funding in neuroscience research? And the third, which was just as important, was how do we make certain that we have an Afro-centric genomic data set? And so I've been on the advocacy side of this. I have to give it to my scientists. They're the ones who know the nuances of it. But clearly for me, it's a social justice issue of epic proportions, of which me as a faith leader has a responsibility to be involved in.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,
And
I guess on the cleanup, I'm sort of the cleanup hitter here. So I'm Dan Weinberger, and I'm the director of this Lieber Institute for Brain Development. I was trained as a medical doctor in neurology, brain disorders, and psychiatry. I worked at the NIH for 3 decades, and I came to Baltimore to create this institute called the Lieber Institute for Brain Development, which was endowed by 2 philanthropic families who had a strong interest in neuropsychiatric illness in their families. And the idea of the institute was to study the brain and to understand how genes and the environment work together to build human brains. And based on genes and the environment, sometimes these developmental trajectories that brains go on across a lifetime deviate from the best adaptations that brains can make, and they have these illnesses. And so in the process of doing this, we as brain scientists realize you can't study brain disease if you don't study the brain. It's sort of a no-brainer. You have to have brains to study brain diseases. So we have teams at the Lieber Institute that work very hard in acquiring donations of human brains from deceased individuals for research. And we collect brains from around the country from 5 different centers, 4 of which are medical examiners' offices, which are brains that happen because of an unexpected death. And these brains are donated by the next of kin, the families, from medical research. And in the process of doing this over the past 10 years, the Lieber Institute has donations from over 700 families of African ancestry. And having spent 3 decades at NIH, having been trained as a neurologist and a psychiatrist, it was very clear to me that while there were clear differences in disease rates, in resilience and susceptibility across ancestries, all ancestries, whether it's African ancestry, European ancestry, Asian ancestry, these ancestries mattered in terms of how frequent some diseases were and how resilient people were to some diseases. But it was clear that of the 700 plus brains that we had, of individuals that were donated from African ancestry families, this ancestry was profoundly underrepresented in the scientific research to understand brain disease. And because we were very keenly aware of this disparity at the research end, we felt we had to have partners in the community that could help us advance this research effort, which was really very much lacking. And because of connections in Baltimore, we made a connection with Reverend Al Hathaway, who really has led the effort to raise funding. We formed a formal partnership with Morgan State University as a formal partner in this. I had the good fortune to convince CAF to join us because he is an extremely influential and powerful voice for raising people's consciousness about the need to recognize ancestry-based differences in human diseases. So I think we've put together a team, and we now have pretty much a first phase project underway to try to reduce some of the disparities that exist in brain research.
Thank you for all of
I
your
could go on.
introduction. So my next question will be, from a scientific perspective, can you actually discuss the differences between pseudosciences such as phrenology? So that is the pseudoscience of taking people's brain or skull measurements, and this was used to justify racism against people of African ancestry, versus things like genetic diversity.
Maybe I can make say a word about that, but I really would like CAF to speak to this too, because a lot of this has to do with basic neuroscience research, which he is really the expert in. you know, human beings are very diverse species. In fact, all species on this planet are very diverse. Species come in all kinds of varieties. And, you know, everybody has two eyes. Everybody has two hands. Everybody has 2 feet. Everybody has one brain, one nose, etc. These are fundamental features of all human beings. And there's no variation in this. But the fact is, human beings come in very different shapes and sizes, and they have different personalities, and they have different skin color, and they have different eye color, and they have all kinds of divergent properties as a species. If we didn't have these variations, by the way, we never would have made it this far as a species. I mean, I like to remind people, human beings are a pretty physically disadvantaged species compared to many other species that are out there. We don't run that fast. We don't have the greatest eyesight. We're not really that strong compared to many other animals. We're susceptible to all kinds of diseases. We eat plants that can be poisonous. The fact that we have survived, despite all of these assaults that have befallen us for the millennia, is because there are people with enough unique features that they can survive anything. So we know, for example, that sickle cell anemia, which happened because of some random mutation in some person in sub-Saharan Africa, made that person immune to the mosquito that transmits malaria. And so sickle cell anemia is thought to have been something that arose as a random event in the life development of some infant that led that individual to be immune to malaria, which made it possible for that individual to pass that gene on. And that's a lot of how human evolution through the many millennia occurs. So there's clearly differences in human beings across this planet. And these differences, which are to a great degree in the DNA of our genome, there are obviously environmental differences, there are social differences, there are, you know, cultural differences, but it all starts with these genetic differences. Genes are the egg, they're not the chicken. They're what starts things going. They are the blueprint by which every cell in your body decides how to grow up and live in the community of other cells in your body. They make every organ, they make, you know, all these individual characteristics that people have. Everybody has good things about their genome that make them strong and resilient. Everybody has some things about their genome that they wish they didn't have in their genome that makes them susceptible to certain illnesses. And so this is, and you know, as Kath said, the great frontier of 21st century medicine, which has been called by President Obama precision to personalized medicine, is to take advantage of these individual differences and improve human health as a result of it.
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about this idea of pseudoscience, right? And I think there are several elements, and it's fun sort of saying this in front of everybody as you're, you know, the person who's responsible for training you, what pseudoscience is, right? So I think the first problem with pseudoscience is the question that we start off with, and I'll sort of push this into the frame of the scientific method. So it's a question or the set of assumptions that one starts off with, and those questions and set of assumptions come from the biases that exist amongst those that ask the questions. It's one of the reasons why the idea of training the next generation and thinking about bringing a diverse set of perspectives to the group of scientists that we're training as part of this initiative is so fundamental from the very beginning. Even as we're thinking about the sciences, we're thinking about how do we make sure postdocs and grad students and other folks of diverse perspectives and experiences are participating in the science as well, because that is sort of some of the critical guards against the pseudoscience that might come out of the other side, right? And, you know, Dr. Revernow doesn't, you know, he sort of says he's going to defer to the scientists, but in this case, he is also part of the scientific inquiry, right? So guarding against that idea of pseudoscience, the first thing that's necessary is to really think about the individual or the set of individuals asking the question and having the community involved from the very beginning. The second thing that's critical is it's always important to keep in mind that when you've framed your question, that your sampling has to be broad enough to essentially try to really disprove yourself. So what happens is, there's a class of medical illnesses, for example, that give you bones that are easy to break and a blue haze around your eyes, right? And so if your sample is small enough, you could do a scientific experiment and you'd say, well, are blue eyes correlated or linked to brittle bones, right? And if, on the one hand, you had those with disease that had hazes of blue, haze around their blue eyes and brittle bones. And on the other hand, you have nobody with brittle bones and nobody with blue eyes. You'd say, of course, blue eyes are linked to brittle bones, right? And because blue eyes are linked to brittle bones, anybody with blue eyes is not going to thrive in society. And perhaps we should have less people with blue eyes in society because it's really bad for brittle bones, right? Because you sampled in that population something that was based on an original hypothesis, which ultimately ends up being pseudoscience once you generate policy as a result of it, right? So there are entire enterprises of science historically that start off with a group of people asking a set of biased questions and then sub-selecting and repeatedly subsetting and throwing out data until they have something that supports the idea that they already started off with for the policy they wanted to generate, right? Which is very different than what we're starting off with. What we're starting off with is saying, human beings are biological organisms. Part of what human beings experience as biological organisms is coded in DNA. That DNA somehow has to match with environment. So we're not throwing out the issue in environment here. It's a core feature of what is expressed when we talk about mental illness. But at the same time, ancestry, which is one of the key hallmarks of how your DNA is passed down across generations, is a key feature of the organization of biology as well. And by keeping all of that in mind, that is our hypothesis, right? We sort of are open to anyone coming in if they want to argue against that hypothesis or disprove it. We're willing to contend in the scientific enterprise around that, right? And then build a team that, as a group of scientists that are linked with community, investigates the health impacts of that, right? That's how we avoid pseudoscience, but it's something that we always have to be mindful of. And we always have to guard against the idea that the data we're generating and our ability to bring the community in can be used as a weapon for pseudoscience, which is why it's so important to have surveillance of the data, to have community involved, to have public engagement, right? Panels like we're doing like this are so critical for making sure as the data is being generated, we're making sure who owns it and we're thinking about how it's interpreted.
Thank you. And that's a perfect segue to my next question, is talking about that level of who's asking the question and also how that's resulted to a lot of medical mistrust. So in the article, you've highlighted the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, the hysterectomy or the sterilization of Black and Latino women, and the unethical extraction of Henrietta Lacks cells that are still in use today, which have revolutionized science as we know it. So can you actually give some insight to where you first learned about medical abuse, like which case it was? And then also a second question is, you've talked about building this rapport with the community and this collaboration with Reverend Hathaway, but like, what does this actually look like on the ground of trying to rectify the past, even if it wasn't you individually, but as science and medicine as a whole?
Yep. So let me take the first part, and then I'm going to toss it over to Dr. Reverend Al. So yeah, I'm sitting at Hopkins. I'm sitting there with Dr. Weinberg. He's telling me about this initiative, and I'm like, so we're just going to sit here at Hopkins, and you're going to tell me about how you're taking Black brains, right? Like, are we just going to act like it wasn't right there? Like, we're not going to do that, right? Right. And so I'm just like, okay, yeah, okay, yeah, sure, we're gonna do this thing. And so like immediately I got off. I'm like Googling like Reverend Al, like I find the email address because I gotta talk to Reverend Al, right? Like, I'm all for this, but like if the community is involved, I need to understand like how the community is involved, how they're thinking about it, what role have they played about drugs, how's this going to be communicated to the broader community, what are his motivations there, how are we going to make sure in the long run that this works, right? What I'm not interested in is generating a genomic database that somebody's going to monetize, that's going to flow money outside the community, and while Baltimore as a city is suffering from depression and drug abuse and all of the things that have been inflicted on the community that's been forgotten forgotten over time, right? That their data and information are now generating resources for somebody else. So that was something that was primary for me. And it's primary for me because I understand that's exactly what happened with Henrietta Lacks, right? So the tissue that was taken without her consent, ultimately people figured out how to monetize it and create incredible companies that made medical innovations. And if this was done the appropriate way, those resources should have been flowing back into Baltimore City, right? And the literacy rate should have been different, and there shouldn't have been lead in the paint in the walls that the kids were growing up and experiencing, right? So this was a primary thing that I had to understand, and I needed to hear about that from Reverend Al. So I'll toss it over to him.
Yeah, you know, one of the blessings of being in the faith community is that I had the opportunity to circulate among a number of persons. I had a very good friend of mine, who was an older friend, who uncle had been actually one of the persons in the Tuskegee experiment. She went to Tuskegee herself. She's passed Sister Maggie Quill, and she was getting a check. And she would come call me up and say, hey, Rev, can you take me to the bank? I got this check, I want to make a deposit. And I said, well, you know, where'd that come from? She said, it's the proceeds from the experiment of Tuskegee of my uncle. And it heightened my attention then that this is very real. This is not something distant that happened somewhere in the past. This is something that has actually happened that affected people that I knew and that I loved. And so I went with that kind of suspicion when I first interacted with the Lieber Institute. And I said to them quite clearly that I wanted to make certain that as we walked every step of the way, there was diversity through every aspect of this inquiry. I wanted to make certain that there were technicians, there were principal investigators, there were researchers, and even the investment of capital. I wanted to make certain that that was from a diverse body of people as well. In my mind, that was the way to ensure that we had accountability. Also was a way to ensure we had credibility, also the way to ensure that we have transparency. Want to make certain that we brought the best minds into this pursuit of truth early on. That's what led me to have the conversation with Morgan State University so that we could build them into this process. And in fact, we need to bring them in at some point in time. They are now pursuing the approval for a master's degree in neuroscience, which is just a tremendous contribution that we will have people of color intimately integrated into this process as we develop it. My perspective from the standpoint of advocacy is that my antenna has to be very high at all times of anything and any sense of injustice. So I bring to the table, this doesn't seem right. Now, the fortunate piece has been I've had amenable relationships with Danny Weinberg and Lieber that we hadn't had that kind of tension. They understand that we want to do this correctly and began to reach out to Dr. Hurd, to Dr. James Gilbreth at Mahari, and we began to reach out to all of these different subject matter experts, Dr. Young at Morgan, to bring them into the process with their critical analysis. I think that is the secret sauce in what we're doing. We're bringing the best minds of diverse backgrounds into this conversation, into this pursuit, in its initial stages. I think that's how you guard against some of the problems we've had in the past.
I must say, I think from the point of view of the scientists at the Lieber Institute, this is the critical feature that gives us confidence that we're not going to go down a path that will end up being misunderstood, abused, or in any way misrepresented. I mean, our goal is very much to understand the science of, human ancestry, which will have payoff not just for the individuals that we study, but for people all over this planet. One of the things that Reverend Al and I have talked a lot about, and we had a number of meetings and we met with the folks at Morgan State, and we met with people at University of Maryland. It's as Kath said, I mean, race is a social construct. Ancestry is part of the biology of human evolution and human history. And, we know that something like, Africa was the birthplace of all life on this planet. Plant life, animal life, human life, it all emerged from Africa. And there were many forms of humans that left Africa over hundreds of thousands of years. But there was one group that left about 40,000 years ago that became modern humans all over the world outside of Africa. But they came from Africa. Africa was the ancestral genome of these people. And these are the people that populated the rest of the world. I like to make the comment that whatever encouraged them to leave, cross the desert, endure whatever was necessary to endure. And it's thought that was about a clan of about 1,500 people. They probably didn't leave because they ran things. They probably left because they were kicked out in some way. And, they changed over these thousands and thousands of years. They weren't white people when they left. This is many, many generations that have changed. And understanding this ancestry is something that's critical for us to be able to solve many of the puzzles of human illness, because these are the founding people of this planet. And this, I think, is an enlightening perspective, because it takes this concept of race out of the discussion. And it is about human beings, how human beings traveled, changed over time, and took on different characteristics. People talk about one of the characteristics that probably selected for lighter skin color was in these Scandinavian countries where there's very little sunlight, that vitamin D, which is critical for human health, needs sunlight to be made in your skin. And if there's too much melanin, you won't be able to get that to happen. So these are how, over time, human features change because the environments give one reason or another to what we call select for them. But I think this is really how we understand human ancestry and how it translates into these different features of human beings. And this is not about good, bad, or in any way a valued statement. It's just trying to understand where people come from and how they have these individual characteristics that make them who they are.
A common and very true statement that's been said in both this discussion and the panel before was race is a social construct, whereas the effects of racism actually hold true in society and affect people's health differently. So I actually want to bring up a recent article that was published in PLOS Biology that was quantifying social media engagement with scientific articles. And these are the authors, Carlson and Harris, reported that actually white nationalists and white ring extremists engage most with preprints about genetics and about neuroscience because they're often using those to reinforce pseudoscience or eugenic rhetorics about, oh, people are different or race is biological. So how should the scientific community actually engage with social media or science communication with the work that you're doing now, specifically with African ancestry and genetic diversity, to ensure that like the way that the data and the results are being interpreted is what you intended?
Let me start by tackling that, and I'll throw it more broadly. First of all, I don't think we as scientists do enough job around science communication and public engagement, right? We have somehow become convinced that our ideas exist in this closed off architecture where it's a free exchange of ideas with our colleagues who have the same shared of biases in the way they think about the world. And then out of the other end comes magical science that's then ready for public consumption. And the notion of preprints, which your early thoughts are shared more broadly, has changed everything. It's changed the whole landscape, right? And nowhere is that more clear than if you even think about what's going on with COVID, where preprints change entire populations' behaviors before they've even gone through the scientific process. So first of all, I think it's really important for us as scientists, having heard that evidence that people are picking up preprints and building word views around our preprints, we have to understand that as we're creating and getting prepared to present the science to our colleagues, whether it's online or in Twitter or in a preprint, it has to say, this is not what this science is saying, right? And I would put that in the abstract introduction, right? We have to operate as if we are putting ideas into the world that will be consumed for purposes that are problematic. And we have to say that that's not what this is, right? So we have to have a greater appreciation for the audience on the other side of our work at every step that we take, right? So we have been doing things, whether it's in meeting with newspapers or NPR, reliably and repeatedly framing what is going to come out of the other end with the data, right? And when that preprint is available, it will capture that exact same framing, right? It will say, this is not what this is, right? We are talking about ancestry. We're not talking about, it doesn't justify thinking about racism or race or racism in this way. This is what it says, but it's really important for the language to be clear about that, right? Even as we were pulling together the original piece for Neuron, articulating the vision, it's why it is spelled out in that way, right? It talks about, one can make the case and say, yes, people of African ancestry tend to participate in studies less, right? And that has a cascading effect. It must be paired with bad things have been done to Black people in this country for health purposes since the very beginning. And the natural outcome of that is I'm not going to be first in line for X to be done to me, right? And so unless there is a building of a relationship and repairing of trust, the outcome of participation in science hasn't happened. But so the narrative around under participation has to be immediately paired with the reason for that, and it's a historical deficit and it's racism. So I think in everything that we try to do, it's important for us to realize that the audience on the other side may not be aware of all that history. So we have to present data and context with the history simultaneously, all of the time, every single time, repeatedly and reliably.
Yeah, I would say that we have been very intentional to make certain that as we present this, it had that construct. So that's where there's a whole body of public TV, radio, newsprint, articles, journal articles. All of that has happened largely because I stepped to the plate saying our community must be informed about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And they need to have the opportunity to be able to give us feedback. That's why there is a public process attached to what we're doing. And I think that that's a healthy dialogue. If you think about it, most times a scientist goes into their lab, they work in their lab, they hunker down, they're pursuing questions. As they look through different analysis, they then emerge with an aha moment. Well, I believe the community can participate in the hunkering down process as well and can help you discover that aha moment. And then you have community buy-in because we all end up at the same place with the same kind of wrestling of dynamics. And that's what has been, I think, a unique aspect of our process has been that we've brought to the table the community, other stakeholders, other interests, so that when the scientist goes to do their tedious work, they're not by themselves. They realize that they're surrounded by collaborative spirits that are not only cheering them on, but critiquing and ensuring that they stay the course.
Yeah, I don't think Dr. Vervinal is being forthcoming enough on the full role of that he's played and how he talks about investments, right? So I'll tell you, man, like there are a couple of stories and exchanges that we had that blew me away, right? So when we're talking about financial investments and philanthropists, right? It's Vervinal who was working with the folks on the Hill, right, to get national investments around it. It's Vervinal that went to Maryland's governor, right? It's Reverend Al, who through another social philanthropist and an investor in Baltimore invested the first 7 figures, right? So like, and that's a man of African ancestry, so it's a Black man. So I think it's really important for people to hear that part of the story, right? And that part of the advocacy, because even in the launching of that initiative, there's some biases that clearly need to be written. I'll tell you, even as we were talking, when I was talking about his investment group, he's like, yeah, we went down the building to see who was renting it, and there was a Lieber in the building that we were renting out to them, right? I love to hear those things, right? Because it flips the whole thing on its head, and you realize that this initiative has the opportunity to counter so many narratives about how science is done, about who it's done for, and ultimately how we can use that to uplift an entire community, right? So this is, I think this project for me, why I had to be involved, it was a masterclass in science communication, community engagement, this is how it should be done.
So following up with that point about the financial investments and how science has to be done, many experiments, clinical trials, and technologies don't consider Black people or people of African ancestry in the preliminary stages of designing these. So a good example is with electroencephalograms and the limitation of Black hairstyles. So let's say me right now with my current hair, I couldn't go and get an EEG done today. So like, what are some of those things that you're doing? Because this is also involving people of African ancestry's participation in these experiments in clinical trials, especially with neuroscience. So even if you combat the medical mistrust or the accessibility to research, then there's that whole technological or lack of financial support for research.
I'll take the first piece and then I'll pass it to Danny. Danny, let me just take.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
The first investment in our work came from a very benevolent foundation in Baltimore that really put the first $275,000 in there. The president and myself had been friends and colleagues for many years, and he placed it in there with this one caveat. Reverend Al, I want you to make certain that the advocates for Black Lives Matter and empowerment have an opportunity to weigh in on what you're doing. So in the whole design, it was that whole array of voices should have the opportunity to participate in this conversation and dialogue. And as we have structured it, we structured it in a way, and Dr. Gerazi's been kind. I do have some market presence. The church that I serve is of a little bit more, it's a step above a storefront. And people connect to me and they communicate with me and I'm able to communicate with them. And that credibility is of value as we move down the road. So one of the things in this that really was not a barrier is that inside of Lieber's collection of brain tissue matter, they already had that process built in. So it wasn't a matter of having to go and talk to people about being donors. That was a hurdle that in this instance we didn't have to cross. And they already had a process by which they received donors that had been vetted, that was recognizable, had protocols. And once we were assured of that, it was comfortable then to be engaged. And I think Dr. Weinberger can speak to that more directly.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, apropos of this whole conversation about transparency, I think what's really unique about this initiative compared to many other big science projects is it's a ground up operation that really the community has been there from day one And every step that's being taken is taken together with the community partners. Also, the science is going to be and is being monitored very carefully by a scientific advisory committee. And Dr. Zarasa and Yasmin Hurd, who's professor of neuroscience at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, New York, are the chairs of our scientific advisory council. So the science is not just a bunch of Lieber Institute scientists running off in a corner doing what they think they should be doing. It's very closely linked with the Scientific Advisory Council. So again, this is a project that is meant to have value to the public health of this community because it has not been adequately served by the scientific research community. And so we believe that this will have enormous value, but it's not going to go anywhere without the community being at its side every step of the way. Has to be that way. Otherwise, trust, because trust is critical. And I think, you know, you asked the question of how does the information, and I think Kath spoke to this very nicely, how does the information not get abused? I mean, obviously, we are not going to be able to stop every white supremacist group from misquoting and misrepresenting the results of these data. But I think because the community is going to be spreading the word about what the importance of this is, and there will be scientific achievements that improve the health of people, I think this will ultimately, you know, be the message that gets out.
Could I also just say, and I will touch on what Dr. Razi and Dr. Weinberger just said. In this process, the community, vis-a-vis in terms of my responsibility, has been the primary raiser of funds. And that gives you place at the table. So not only the first $275,000 the community raised, we raised $1.25 million from the governor of the state of Maryland. As was mentioned, we had a very African-American philanthropist give another $1 million. And then the work that we did inside of Capitol Hill was having our senators, both our senior senator, Senator Cardin, and then our junior senator, Van Hollen, who sat on the Appropriations Committee. I went to a colleague of mine who is the president of the National Broadcasters Association, whose cousin is also on the Senate Appropriations Committee, who happened to be a Republican, and they got together. And then the next thing you know, they were able to place language inside of the last budget that allowed for us to potentially access about $21 million. Now, in most instances, it's the researcher who responds to a RFP or some kind of notice of a funding availability that then responds. In this instance, it was the community driving the acquisition of capital to be invested in this process, which I think gives it a level of transparency, because we have to be accountable to those for whom made the investments. And then the researchers and scientists have to be accountable to us, who therefore are accountable to the investors in the process. I think it's a different means of funding from what you traditionally think of in terms of research.
Yeah,
and we're about 5 minutes out, so I'm just gonna ask one last question before we wrap up. So this had to do with the statistical challenge that you spoke about in the article about how it's gonna take a lot of work to analyze this complex data set of the genetic diversity present in African ancestry. So what are the best practices for building these statistical models that capture all of these different factors that intersect with race or racism? So this could be things like stress or the neighborhoods that people are living, the access in healthcare. So how are you building this statistical model so that you're still capturing what's actually happening, but also still looking at all of the things that are risk or maybe neuroprotective factors? How do you actually go about that from a scientific perspective?
Yeah, so let me say a little bit of something from the question before and then dovetail it into this, right? So this is a neuro-racism panel. So as you know, everybody out there in webinar land realizes, we are currently in the middle of a brain initiative, right? Where the goal is to understand the human brain and all of its complexities. And one of the phases of that is going to be building a human cell atlas. And so as we build a cell atlas, this is the 200 billion cells in the brain, each with their own sort of gene expression profile. One of the challenges is going to make sure that that brain atlas is representative of humanity and not just like we talked about the genomic databases of a European ancestry. Right? It would be absurd if we made a human cell atlas that was a male brain and not a female brain, right? You can immediately appreciate all of those challenges. But things have happened in the past where we've developed medicines and interventions that work better in men, or more primarily in men, than in women. To combat that, it's important for the voice to be in the room. Right? And I can say this to you so clearly. This is why it's important for you to finish your PhD and tell people the leads for the EEG do not work with your hair, right? It's why we're thinking so clearly about training. And over time, we'll come back and hopefully talk to you about how we've extended this to more HBCUs and minority serving institutions and figure out how to link postdoc trainees into it. But more people have to be in the room to raise these issues, right? The issue about scale and scope of the genomics that we're going to have to navigate through, it's complex, right? We know that environment changes the brain. There's no doubt about it, right? The brain is an organ that optimizes the function of human beings within environment. And those environmental variables lead to epigenetic changes, some of which are passed down across generations, it turns out. Shout out to some of my brilliant colleagues doing that work. But it means that we need people asking the exact questions that you're asking. They have to build into our models. And these are extremely interdisciplinary questions that we need to be wrestling with, right? For me to say, here's the answer, here's a simple way to do it, means I haven't thought earnestly about the problem, right? Like, we actually need a team of scientists at population level scale. We need all of y'all out there and all of your friends to be thinking about this question as we move it forward. So that's why we need you to finish your PhD. That's why I mess with you. That's why I push you so hard. So do what you got to do.
That is exactly the right answer. We need more Gwinnells. That's exactly the right answer.
Yep.
That's what it will take.
Don't cry, Gwen. It'll be okay.
That's exactly what it
And keep in mind, you got Reverend Al praying for you and cheering you on.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for all of the contributions today. And we really appreciate the discussion on neuro-racism. And we will all publish the paper on Twitter in case people didn't get a chance to interact. So thank you so much. And that's our panel for today.
Thanks,